Hi, my name is Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program here at Columbia University. We have a special guest today. Thanks for attending. Our guest is Tabitha Mallory. And Tabitha is an expert, one of the world's leading experts on fisheries and on China's role in the fishing industry and in fishery management. She is the founding CEO of the China Ocean Institute, which is a consulting firm. And she teaches at the Henry Jackson School at the University of Washington, where she's a proud alum as an undergraduate. She finished Phi Beta Kappa there, and she moved on to Johns Hopkins University, where she got a PhD with distinction. But the two favorite elements of her CV for me are that she was a China and the World Fellow at Princeton University. So we're really proud to welcome her back with her expertise to the program to speak to you today. The second thing on her CV that I'm proud of is that she is a public intellectuals program fellow at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which is a program that brings scholars into the policy world in Washington. And that's a program that I helped create when I was on the board. And it's very consistent with the China and the World program mission of encouraging scholars to work on topics and subjects that are of interest in the policy world. And fisheries are right at the front of that. And when you think about international relations in China, people think about cross-strait relations and security. They think about international political economy, trade, finance, and they think about the environment and climate change. And fisheries is one of those issues that really bridges intellectual political economy and the environment. And is so important to the livelihoods of so many millions of people around the world, and particularly in the Asia Pacific. And we're really glad to have Tabitha on our team of former fellows, because she's probably the only one who studies this incredibly important topic that so often gets missed in the political science realm. So today she's going to talk about lessons about global ocean governance from China's fisheries. And I can't think of a better expert to have to speak about that subject. So please join me in welcoming her. You can't clap because we're on Zoom, but I'll turn it over to Tabitha.
Thank you, Tom. That was a really kind introduction. And thanks to the China and the World program for hosting me. Thanks to Daniel Suhensky for putting all this together. And thanks to all of the audience for attending today. And I really appreciate the way that you characterized fisheries, Tom, because that's actually what interested me in this topic originally, is that it's at the intersection of all these different issues. It's very interdisciplinary. It calls for not just interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary solutions for it. And so I think it's really fascinating, but it's also one of the issues that makes it really hard and complex to deal with. And I think a little bit of that might come out today. So let me, I'll pull up my slides. And I can get them full screen. There we go. Wait till they come up. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see these okay? Okay. So it's really different coming back to give a lecture in this capacity as opposed to when I was actually a fellow in the program, when we're encouraged to have a very solid theoretical foundation for the work that we're presenting. So today I'm taking a little bit of a different approach. This is a little bit more policy oriented. It's not going to be very academic, not very heavy on theory. And a lot of it draws from my own work on China's distant water fishing fleet, and I'll explain all of that. But I didn't want to just talk about my own work. And when Daniel had approached me about speaking about this, he was kind of asking if I wanted to, just talk about some of the recent work that I've done. So I think that'll come out. But I really did want to contextualize it in the larger discussion about particularly the new Biden administration's policy towards China, and especially on fisheries, and just link it to some of these other issues. So I'll talk a little bit about BB&J, which is the negotiations on getting a treaty on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. But that's not an area that I've done a lot of primary research in. So most of my research is on the fisheries end, but I kind of wanted to make some links to some of these other broader issues that fisheries kind of fits within. So let me come to my outline. So what I'll do is start talking about China's fishing industry, define what China's distant water fishing industry is, and then talk about how some of the policies have changed over the years. Talk about some of the geopolitical motivations for the policies, which I think is really important. There's some really important questions around that. I've done a lot of work on subsidies policy, and so I'll speak a little bit about that. And there's I think a really great example with the Galapagos islands last year with the swarm of Chinese fishing vessels around those islands. And it was a lot in the news, and I think there's an interesting subsidies angle here. And then talk about some of the changes in Chinese global fishing trends, and then also kind of related some of their overseas subsidiaries and bases, kind of all the things that keep us up at night. And then talk about some of the US policy response to this and continuation of some of the responses from the last administration into the current one. And then I will reflect on what this means for other issues. So let me get started. So if I were to characterize China's fishing industry in simple ways, I would say they really have three different policies. And one is towards their domestic waters, which partly includes their EEZ. I mean, it's complicated because they haven't completely delineated the maritime boundary. But in their own waters, what they consider their own waters, they're actually very strict about fishing and about addressing IU fishing, which is illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. They're really trying to decrease capacity and the pressure on their own domestic stocks, recognizing that their stocks have been depleted for some time now. It gets complicated when we get out of the waters that are mostly undeniably China's. So when we get to the South China Sea, for example, then we've got this whole other layer of the maritime disputes. I'm not going to talk about that so much today. We can if we get to the Q&A if people are interested. But in the case of the South China Sea, China's maritime claims really trump the concern over IU fishing. And in fact, China often uses IU fishing as kind of an excuse to exert some of its jurisdiction, what it claims to be its jurisdiction over that area. So it's, it'll claim that it's trying to protect the marine environment and police fishing in the South China Sea, but a lot of people are arguing that's, and I think there's evidence that that's really kind of a lever for China to use to assert its claims over that area. But that's a whole quagmire that I don't want to get into today. So then the distant water fishing industry, which is a lot of the work that I've done. And it's interesting because China defines it a little bit differently. So it's fishing on the high seas, which belong to no country. And then also in the exclusive economic zones of other countries. And this is on the basis of bilateral fisheries agreements. And China does not include any fishing in the near seas as part of the distant water fishing industry. So that is a little bit different than what a lot of, especially fisheries experts, would define as their distant water fishing industry. And so it's even, the South China Sea has its own complications, but even, Chinese fishing in the South Korean EEZ that is allowed by the South Koreans, China considers that to be the domestic fleet, even though it's in someone else's EEZ, because it's a regional ocean that's shared with South Korea. And so the distinction is important because when we talk about the policies, they're very different policies. The domestic fleet has different licensing requirements than the distant water fleet does. They're not actually allowed to hold the same license, so you can't be engaged in both domestic fishing and distant water fishing. They have different subsidy policies, so it's important to keep these distinctions in mind. Although it gets a little complicated because sometimes when you hear people estimating the total size of the fishing fleet in general, there's a lot of debate you see in media about that. But when it comes to the distant water fleet, there's a report recently that said there's 17,000 distant water fishing vessels, and that's because they're including some of the fishing that by a very a definition that really adheres closely to kind of our widespread knowledge of international law, that anything outside the EEZ is considered distant water fishing. But in reality, the number of vessels that are considered by China to be its distant water fishing industry are about 3,000, with some that are maybe reflagged, maybe up to 4,000 that are, like around the world in kind of the capacity that we think of when we think of distant water fishing. So a lot of those other vessels, if it's 17,000, a lot of those 13,000 or something are still just in the East China Sea, South China Sea, Yellow Sea. And not that there aren't problems there, but it's important to understand the difference. There are a lot of concerns about the distant water fishing industry in terms of governance, especially host countries and their regulation over their own fisheries, and corruption influencing that. Socioeconomic concerns, Chinese operations kind of detracting from the livelihoods of subsistence fishermen, especially in host countries. Environmental concerns, both in other countries and on the high seas. A lot of concerns about the global political influence from a state that has little transparency. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the issues with the transparency, but we essentially don't know what's in most of these agreements that China signs with these host countries to allow access to their fish. They're often tied to other deals. And then there are a bunch of concerns around human rights, with the crew often being out at sea for years and not getting paid, and some of this makes the news too. So for years, China's distant water fishing industry policy was just expand, build as many vessels as possible. And in recent years, we've seen a shift in that policy. And a lot of this is in response to international criticism of China's actions with its distant water fleet. And a recognition too that a lot of its activities are unsustainable. As we have more and more Chinese academics, kind of the development of somewhat of a civil society sector in China, they bring back kind of these sustainability ideas, and you kind of see that start to kind of make its way through the policy apparatus. And so one of the really big, I've heard a lot of people in China point to the incident in which the Argentine Coast Guard vessel sank a Chinese fishing vessel in 2016 as a big turning point. It was hugely embarrassing for China. It got a lot of media attention. And so China responded to that. So a lot of these changes are just in the past 5 or 6 years. There were commitments to reduce fishery subsidies, to strengthen the observer program, so onboard observers. In response to that Argentine incident, they created a distant water fishing training and compliance center at Shanghai Ocean University. There have been changes in not just the kind of general 13 5-year plan on fishing, but also one that's specifically on distant water fishing, capping the number of vessels to 3,000, capping the number of fishing companies, total fishing companies. And there's language on addressing IUU fishing for the first time in that's actually the fisheries law, but there's a blacklist in the distant water 13 5-year plan. So if any of the vessels or captains are caught engaging in IUU fishing, they'll be put on a blacklist and have subsidies taken away from them. So there's kind of more definitive fines and punishments for engaging in IUU fishing. But then we actually did see kind of some clear language in the new draft of the fisheries law that is not quite out yet, but there's a draft circulating, and also in these updated distant water fishing regulations that China updated for it significantly for the first time last year. These were originally issued in 2003. So it was the first significant update in over 15 years. And then last year, China also established 2 high seas fishing moratoria. They're kind of these 2 small patches in the, both in the East Pacific and then in the Southwest Atlantic for squid for a few months. And then earlier this year, China, last year they announced measures requiring high seas transshipment to be reported to the government, and that entered into effect in January of this year. So this is great. There's a bunch of policy changes, kind of moderating the expansion of the industry, recognizing that there are problems. But a really big question about this is, how is all of this going to be implemented and enforced? And so we've seen a lot of rhetorical changes, but a lot of the actions that back this up are still a little bit iffy. Oh, and that's the 2020 distant water fishing regulations, the cover on the right side. And then I think a really big question about this is how to address the geopolitical motivations. And these are somewhat newer. China originally launched its distant water fishing industry out of concerns over food security. It launched in 1985. This is a couple of decades after other big nations had their own distant water fleets. And this was, when the Chinese recognized that their own waters were overfished. And so they launched the distant water fishing industry, also a big aquaculture industry, which has grown. I think a lot of people are familiar with that. And then, just interest in economic growth and profit. Those are really kind of the initial motivations. But now there's also this layer of geopolitical motivations that I think we kind of ignored or at our peril. And this started with, kind of in general, the call in 2012, a lot of people know about this, at the 18th Party Congress, to build China into a maritime great power. And then there was an analyst in China who said, and I actually went back to find it, I wanted to include the source, but the source had disappeared, but it was a write-up of China's fisheries policy. Always save your things you read on websites. And someone referred to, the 18th Party Congress was when the distant water fishing industry met its strategic opportunity. And right after all this happened in 2013, the State Council raised the marine fisheries to the level of a strategic industry. And so this is not just the distant water fishing industry. This also has important implications for the South China Sea and the use of the fishing vessels down there for strategic purposes. But it also had a lot of implications for the distant water fishing industry. And so I think this quote from the former deputy director of the Fisheries Bureau at the then Ministry of Agriculture, now Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, Liu Shenli, he describes the distant water fishing industry as embodying China's real presence on the high seas, advocates for China's rights and interests on the high seas, and elevates China's voice as a sovereign country over the management and distribution of marine resources, breaking up the long-term monopoly of high seas resources by a few Western countries. And so a lot of if you read some of the government, particularly there's some task force analyses, some academic analyses, they talk about the distant water fleet providing a presence at sea that can translate into more access to resources. So it essentially, and a lot of the regional fisheries management organizations around the world operate this way. You get a share of the quota of the fish stocks based on your historical presence. And so if you have had more of a presence there, then you are entitled to a larger share of those stocks. And so China has noticed this and is kind of working to do this. And I've also heard a few people say that, because China's population is 19% of the world's population, that they should be entitled to 19% of the ocean's resources. So kind of interesting ways to think about this. And of course, there is some history of distant water fleets being used for geopolitical and geostrategic purposes. And the best example is during the Cold War. The Soviet Union, they used to have the largest fleet in the world. They used their fleet for reconnaissance and surveillance. So I'm not saying that China's doing that today, but I don't think it's lost on them that is an option. I've also read in, I have never really seen this in a government document explicitly, but I've seen in distant water fishing company reports and other non-governmental sources in Chinese. They've referred to the distant water fishing industry as China's second navy. And so, seeing it as a presence around the world that if, push came to shove, they could be called on to provide security support for China's military forces if they needed to. And I think that holds for some of the bases that they're building too for fish bases. So I'll get to that later though. And I guess we can talk about, maybe we'll talk about some of the, about this question at the end, but how do we address these geopolitical motivations? And I think that's really important because they're not going away. And so, you know, is there, the way I think about it is like, is there a way that we can accommodate some of the geopolitical motivations in a, you know, environmentally sustainable way, in a way that doesn't threaten other countries' security? So I don't think we've really figured out a good answer to that, but it's maybe something we can discuss in the Q&A. So turning to some of the policies and some of the kind of issues with transparency. So one of the things that I've been doing a lot of work on is subsidies. And this is the subject of about 20 years of negotiations at the WTO to get an agreement to discipline fishing subsidies. The reasoning behind it being that subsidies essentially skew the bottom line for fishing companies and make fishing profitable when it wouldn't be otherwise. And so I've done this for a few years now, kind of tracking China's subsidies. And well, first of all, it's important because China is the #1 subsidizer of its fishing industry in the world compared to other countries. So out of, there was an estimate in 2018 that global total fishing subsidies were about $35 billion. Harmful subsidies, so capacity enhancing, often like fuel subsidies, were 22.2 billion. And then of that, of the total, China's subsidy program accounted for 21% of that. And then of the total harmful subsidies, China accounted for 27% of that. So it's a really big issue, you know, to have China be a part of this agreement at the WTO, which was supposed to be agreed last year, but was postponed because of COVID. And so where the transparency issues come in, so I've got a couple of photos of the Chinese fisheries yearbooks. And so what I've done in the past, it's all written in prose, it's not available in tabular format in the fisheries yearbooks, but I used to go through and like read and kind of put it in tabular format. And so on the left-hand side is the yearbook in 2012, and you can see those as indicated by the blue brackets. That was the information that was available in 2012, including a breakdown of the fuel subsidies, the amount that was given overall, and also a breakdown of how much went to the domestic fleet versus how much went to the distant water fleet. It was pretty detailed. And then just last year, the yearbook only provided, so on the right-hand side, just that little tiny paragraph is indicated by that blue bracket. And I didn't want to put too many text-heavy slides up, but if you look at it in tabular format, there's like this really intricate breakdown from before and then just like nothing now. And so China has not been very clearly reporting its especially its fuel subsidies. And what they've done is conflate the fuel subsidies with other programs and kind of delegate it to the local level. And then all the localities take that money that comes from the central government and do with it what they wish. And there's really no accounting at the central government level, which enables China to say, you know, truthfully that it doesn't, you know, keep track of the fuel subsidies. So that's an ongoing challenge. And another challenge is that China is pushing for to be considered as a developing country, and so in receipt of special and differentiated treatment at the negotiations. So, you know, meaning a little bit more time or being exempt from some of the restrictions, which is, you know, it's tough to argue that when it's the country that takes in the largest proportion of the world's global wild catch. And so this is excluding aquaculture. It's the #1 producer of seafood overall, but it's the #1 producer of just, you know, capture fisheries, which is what the subsidies focus on. And it's also at this point at a per capita income level that, according to at least the World Bank, is above that threshold for a developed country. And they also provide the most subsidies to their industry. And so where you see this kind of like playing out is, so here's the Galapagos example. So last year, there was a lot of media attention given to this fleet of Chinese fishing vessels right outside the exclusive economic zone of the Galapagos. And so each one of those pink dots is essentially an AIS transmission from the vessels. And so what we did was, we wrote an article about this. What we did was we figured out which provinces these vessels were home ported to. And so here's a map showing where they came from. Most of these vessels were fishing for squid, and Zhejiang is kind of the home of the squid fishery in China. So most of them come from Zhejiang province. The second kind of largest proportion comes from Shandong, and then followed by Fujian. Some of them we didn't know. And then it's really no coincidence that those are the subsidies, sorry, those are the provinces that get the most in subsidies. And so if you look, and also the ones that provide the most catch. So on the left-hand side, I've got a breakdown of catch by province. So you can see the leading ones are Zhejiang, Fujian, and Shandong. And then this is one subsidy program for the distant water fishing industry. And you can see, the breakdown on the right-hand side. Those are also the top 3 provinces that receive those subsidies. So there's a very clear correlation between the financing of these operations and their presence and activity on the ocean. And I think it's worth pointing out too that there is a nascent system of regulation in that area around the Galapagos, well, in general, but it's the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization. But until this year, until 2021, squid has not been regulated. And so in the past 3 or 4 years, you've seen this huge presence of Chinese fishing vessels for squid. And the vessels are registered to the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization, but the number of them far exceed the number of vessels from any other country. So it's about 700 from China. And the next largest country, I think it was like Peru at like 100 or something. And so, I think you can argue that, and you've seen this strategy written out, by Chinese analysts for other stocks around the world, that, if you can target the ones that are not yet regulated, you can really benefit from those operations before the international community regulates them. And then it also means, getting kind of a larger slice because you can demonstrate that you've had fishing presence there for a while. So kind of turning to some of the shifts in policies again, there are some trends that we've seen. So while the Chinese distant water fishing industry has been capped, there is some policy to consolidate the supply chain to capture the value added along the way. So in the past, China did not have the technology to store or really transport frozen fish back to China, but that is changing. So in the past, they used to sell a lot of their fish just kind of on local markets. And now, this going out policy that China announced in 2001, this is not just fishing, but you've seen some talk of there being a coming back policy. So, China's overseas, so if the going out policy was a policy to encourage Chinese companies to find investment and, market opportunities abroad, the coming back policy is, let's take advantage of those, those opportunities abroad and bring them back to benefit China. And so in 2018, what this means for the fishing industry is that they're sending more catch home. So in 2018, China sent 65% of its catch home, and that's up from only about 10 years ago, 49% of its catch being sent home. And there's a lot of marketing in China. And, I think that, I didn't say this earlier, but I think another motivation for China's distant water fishing industry is status and national pride. It's portrayed this way in China too, that the Chinese population can now buy fish that was caught by its own fleet abroad instead of, imports from other countries. And then we've also seen a shift towards the high seas away from fishing in the exclusive economic zones of other countries. And this is partly because host countries have made it harder for China to fish there, increasing regulations, requirements that, foreign fleets, or requirements, banning foreign fleets, which China has sometimes gotten around by reflagging their vessels or forming joint ventures. But this is, increased costs for China. And so China has shifted to the high seas. And so we also see a rise in the catch from the high seas, rising to 66% in 2017, which was up from 43% in 2010. And this is also in response to the fact that a lot of the high seas, especially for squid, which is the second largest proportion of China's overall distant water catch, A lot of that comes from the high seas, and it's not regulated for the most part, except in some spotty areas like South Pacific Carafimo, which was only started this year. Oh, and that picture on the right is a transport vessel unloading catch at the port in Zhejiang, which is mostly squid. And there's lots of squid processing facilities there. So one of the things that China is doing is building the infrastructure to support this consolidation of the supply chain. And so that includes these 3 major home ports in China. The biggest one, or the longest, I guess, existing one, maybe the biggest one, is in Zhejiang. So it's largely squid focused. And then there's one that was built in Shandong that focuses a lot on tuna. And then there's a pretty recent one in Fuzhou, in Fujian province. And I can't remember what species they're focusing on, but these have been around just really for the past 3-4 years or something. And if you look at the numbers of vessels and catch that they're planning on accommodating, I mean, you kind of wonder, how are they gonna, they've capped their number of fishing vessels, and they're slowing the rate of catch from the distant water fleet, but they've also laid out all these preparations and set expectations for catch that exceed that. And then one of the other things that they're doing is setting up the infrastructure around the world to support this as well. So that includes a bunch of subsidiaries around the world. This was kind of pieced together from the Ministry of Commerce website, about nearly 200 as of last year. A lot of those are in Africa, some in Asia, mostly Southeast Asia, a bunch in South America. And then less is known about the overseas distant water fishing bases, but these are largely bases and processing facilities to support onshore processing and also to provide support to the fleets that are often out at sea for years, and they've received a lot of investment. But again, these numbers, this is a quote from 2014. There's been not that much, I think, out there to help us get a picture of what the scale of this really is. I do have some photos from a research trip I did in China. This is from Zhejiang, but it shows, and this is only from Zhejiang, but shows like where the fishing grounds are for the companies that are based in Zhejiang. You can see it's pretty much all over the place, but mostly in developing countries. And then here's a couple of maps of what the bases around the world look like. And again, this is just from Zhejiang. So the other provinces with large distant water fishing companies have their own sets of bases and subsidiaries around the world. So let's talk a little bit, and sorry, it's like a really text heavy slide. Don't worry, we're not going to read all that. So let's talk a little bit about what the US response to this has been. Let me keep an eye on the time too. I'll try to wrap this up pretty soon. So we have some time for Q&A. So I've honestly, as someone who's worked on fisheries now for, I guess it's been like 13 years, there's been a really big shift in US policy response too. So when I first started working on this, like 2008, sometimes I'd go to these maritime security dialogues. I'd be the only fisheries person there. And often the only woman too, because a lot of the security community is men. And I would talk about the security aspects of the fisheries and people would just kind of look at me blankly. So it's been really nice to see the concern across the whole government in the US with this focus on addressing especially illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And I think the most significant way that's happened is through the Maritime Security and Fisheries Enforcement, the Maritime Safe Act, which was passed in 2019. And it's also, it's all at the bottom, but it's also received funding well, actually it should be, it was funded in 2019 and 20 for the following year. So we have funding all through 2021 from last year from the National Defense Authorization Act to address IUU fishing. And so what this sets up is a whole of government approach to addressing this issue. And so you've got an interagency working group that features 21 agencies, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's the Coast Guard, the Navy, NOAA, of course, which is, the one that has the National Fisheries Governance Office Administration in it, State Department, USTR for trade. And so all these different, USAID is a really big one. So all these different agencies are, issuing their own kind of strategies on addressing IUU fishing. And what the U.S. has done now is they've kind of taken on, I think because there's so much attention given to the Galapagos last year, they're starting with a focus on South America and Central America, Latin America. And I think they're asking a lot of the right questions. There's a lot that we don't know about the fish stocks in those areas. And so there's efforts to do more stock assessments, look at ways in which the US can help, I think, especially with technology for monitoring, control, and surveillance. I think what's one of the other positives of this is that in the past, a lot of the engagement, the US engagement with South America has been, or Latin America, has been the drug war. That's kind of what we've kind of come together against. And that is, it doesn't really unify people the way this issue does, because it's recognized across the board that illegal IUU fishing has negative impacts for the livelihoods of, pretty much everyone in Latin America. And the Latin American countries are also behind that. Whereas with drugs, I mean, that's more of a kind of a US priority than it is for, these countries that are producing the drugs. So this is something I think that's brought together a lot of people. The other really great thing about this is it's a really nonpartisan issue too. It really has support from both the Democrats and the Republicans. So this was launched during the Trump administration. I don't think it's because of Trump. These have been efforts that have kind of been underway for really a couple decades now, depending on what you're counting as part of this. I think the previous administration was using this as a lever to attack China. And more recently, just kind of in some of my conversations, I think we've seen a shift in the tone with the new Biden administration, still emphasizing that this is important. And I hope that they, continue to work on this issue. And there's plans in the National Defense Authorization Act to do that. They have mandated reports to Congress on both IUU fishing and distant water fishing to be submitted to them. So I think the work will continue, and I think having the more balanced approach, not just kind of trying to figure out a way to attack China is beneficial. And it seems like so far the administration is lining up, the right people to do that. John Kerry, he's the climate person, but he was really big on oceans, and actually the backdrop of all of this is the effect of climate change on the oceans. I mean, that of all possible things will have more of an effect on our outcomes with fisheries than really anything else will. So that's important too. So let me talk a little bit. So here I want to shift to talking kind of like, what can we take away from all of this in terms of these other issues, ocean issues, particularly our global commons. So other commons that we have are outer space, cyberspace is one of them, but the oceans is, it's a shared commons. And so here's a map of the parts of the ocean that are under the maritime jurisdiction of countries through exclusive economic zones. And then everything in the darker blue is international waters or the high seas. And so about 64% of the surface of our oceans is high seas. So they belong to no country. And actually 95% of the volume of the oceans is high seas because it's so deep. The EEZs tend to be pretty shallow. And so one of the kind of more recent efforts to govern the high seas is this these negotiations to get a treaty to manage biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So BB&J, I probably should have written that up there. But it's, this has been going on for the past couple of years. They've had a few preparatory meetings, and some more formal meetings. It all got delayed with COVID. But what's been really interesting is that these negotiations and this treaty that they're trying to put together has to interface with an existing at least 190 existing multilateral and bilateral agreements on ocean affairs. And so this is not even including, kind of general global governance treaties that, may pertain to oceans, but ones that directly include oceans. There are a number of them. And so that's one of the challenges. There are 4 pillars for BB&J. One is to figure out a way to govern marine genetic resources. So one of the really fascinating things about the ocean is that there is a lot of potential for developing, particularly marine pharmaceuticals. So we've got sessile species in the ocean, which are animals that don't move. You don't have that on land, but coral, they're animals. And they've developed these really interesting ways to defend themselves without moving, unlike land creatures. And so these could be used as inputs for antibiotics, antivirals. And then there's a bunch of other kind of scientific developments that could be made through this too. There's a pillar for developing area-based management tools like marine protected areas. Also another 3rd pillar on environmental impact assessments, and then a 4th one on capacity building and marine technology transfer to benefit, especially developing countries that aren't a part of this. And so I think the challenge here is that BB&J has to complement existing agreements that have something to do with biodiversity. So, high seas fisheries, for example, deep sea mining, which can damage the marine habitat that hosts a lot of biodiversity, marine pollution, intellectual property rights, kind of biodiversity protection in general through the Convention on Biodiversity. And so you have a real challenge of fragmentation here. How do you coordinate across all of these different issue areas and balance all the needs? And it's also challenging because it's very easy to politicize this, and especially because you have so many companies that have vested interests in this, and they're very, their operations are based on highly scientific and technical information. And so it's not very easily understood by kind of the general public. And so you also, in that sense, have as well just incomplete information. So information asymmetry, and then there's just a lot we don't know about the oceans. I won't go into that. There's some really cool charts I could have shown about how little we know. So the companies around the world have a really big interest in developing these resources, and we need them too. I mean, like a lot of the minerals that come from deep sea mining are, powering things like our cell phones. But there's a lot of unfair distribution when it comes to who is able to access these. And so I found this interesting statistic that of 13,000 genetic sequences that were taken from 862 marine species, 98% of those were turned into patents. So there's like 13,000 essentially patents on these marine species. And 98% of those are held by 10 countries. And so maybe this is something we can get into in the Q&A, but it really it kind of poses this really interesting question of, freedom of the seas, the Hugo Grotius concept of, like no one should control all the oceans and everyone should have access to the oceans for, economic gain or whatever they want, versus, this concept of the common heritage of mankind and wanting to preserve this, for our future. And it's not, without, I think, real concern. I mean, there's a recent report says that about 1 million species are at risk of going extinct. So this has really important implications for our future. And so it brings up, I think one of the other, when we're thinking about the Biden administration, the changes in the new administration, I think one of the really positive things is the focus on science that has kind of now been put at the center. And, a treaty like this has really important implications for science. And, it's, you essentially have to have science informing policy making. It has to be salient, so it has to be relevant. It has to be credible. A lot of people have to agree on it, and it has to be legitimate in that it affects the, kind of the broadly held interests of various stakeholders. And so when I was thinking about this, in terms of like, what can we learn from China's, fisheries policy, and what this says about, China's interests on the oceans. And actually, I have another slide here. I had a bunch of slides I could have shown too on where China's deep seabed mining interests are, but China holds the most deep seabed mining exploratory contracts, 5 in the world. A lot of them are in that Clarion-Clipperton zone. And I think another really interesting question here too is the International Seabed Authority, the science committee that decides who gets a lot of these exploratory contracts, is made up of something like 24 people. And so, you've got this small group of people that are determining how these resources are distributed for, essentially, 7 million people or more. And so I think it just, I think this will be kind of in conclusion too, and then I want to open it up for questions. But I think, when we think about China and its rise and its search for resources, it's important to, I think, address a lot of the challenges that are there. I mean, there are challenges with transparency. There are, some of the questions I kind of brought up earlier. One of the possible roles for the U.S. is helping some of these developing countries, these host countries, have the right information so that they can make decisions about who's fishing in their waters. So like, stock assessments and the ability to control their own waters, because that's a challenge for them. So I do think we need to address those issues, but there's a layer here of, it's not just kind of like, which states are acting poorly and which ones aren't. I mean, I think if you look at the records of a lot of other states, they've either done the very same thing for years, or still doing the very same thing, or have contributed to some of these problems through trade. So, the United States imports a lot of its seafood. And so, coming back to squid, for example, I think it's a great illustration of how we could contribute better to this problem. So the squid's largely unregulated around the world. And if you look at the US import data on squid, there are about 30 to 40 commercial species of squid around the world. And the US trade data only differentiates, they only identify 2 species of squid, and then the rest are lumped into one genus, which is the, up from species. And then it's just like otherwise not identified. And so we aren't even, we import a bunch of seafood from China, but we're not distinguishing, like what kind of squid this is, where it comes from. And that's also true, I think, of a lot of developed countries like the EU. The EU is a problem too with like its subsidies. If we go by their solution to the subsidies issue at the WTO, it's like the least amount of protection, even though I think they'd like to present to the world that they're very progressive on their sustainable management of fisheries. And so, and then when we think about this in terms of, just distribution of resources, the vested interests of companies and countries' willingness to back those companies, I think, is a really important aspect of this discussion. And it's not just China that is funding and backing its companies on this, but a lot of countries, including the United States, would like to see a continuing fragmentation of a lot of these systems of governance in order to maintain the access that they have to the resources. So, the US, for example, doesn't want to subject its own fisheries rights, to this kind of larger framework of, a biodiversity treaty that protects more. So I think that's something we really have to grapple with. So there's lots of different levels here. And I think if we, really kind of focus on what's important, which I think a lot of people would argue is, biodiversity, climate change, I think it can help us gain some clarity about how to approach some of these issues. So that's pretty much it. I've got, there's one more issue I was going to talk about, which is the polar issues. And there's a lot of marine protected areas. Well, not, there's two marine protected areas that have been set up for Antarctica. And there's a lot of other proposed ones. And it's been China and Russia that have been hesitant to agree to set off those areas for protection. And if you look at, back to the subsidies, if you look at the types of vessels that are being built now, which vessels are getting the most in subsidies, it's the Antarctic krill fishing vessels. So China's interested in, I think, protecting its industry down there. But anyway, so I think that's hopefully enough information to have a decent discussion. Thank you for your attention, and I hope we can talk more about this.
Okay, thanks so much, Tabitha. I learned a lot, as always, from you. And you talked about a couple of issues that I think relate to some of the questions that people have about China's foreign policy more generally towards its own region and globally. And one is about the sovereignty issue. If you could call up your map that shows the EEZs and the open seas or the high seas.
Yeah. Let me I'm gonna share my screen again. 1 second. Let me see if I can go back.
It's about 3 back, I think, from the end.
Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, so I think this map is pre-2016 tribunal conclusion at The Hague about the meaning of the South China Sea, because
oh yeah, you're right.
South China Sea, there were no holes. There were no holes in the EEZs. So if you treat all of the features down there as rocks instead of islands, you would have holes in the EEZs. So what I didn't know before your talk was that China had different licensing for what you call the IUU fishing vessels and the deep water fishing vessels. So it would be interesting from an intelligence point of view to see where China allows deep water fishermen to fish, because it would strongly suggest where they believed the waters were truly international and where they weren't, because China hasn't clarified its claims in the South China Sea, as you know, under international law. But if they never allowed a deep water fishing vessel to operate in the South China Sea, it would strongly suggest that they're treating the entire 9-dash line, not the whole South China Sea, but everything inside the 9-dash line as internal waters.
Yes.
And it ought to be possible to get the ship numbers of the various different fishing vessels to see if they are IUU licensed or DW licensed, right? So that's my first reaction. And my second question is, how does the licensing system fit into the maritime militia? Because I kept thinking of Andrew Erickson during your talk and his work on the maritime militia at the Naval War College. And this idea of a second Navy. They have a Coast Guard, which is kind of a second Navy, but they also have this maritime militia, which is like the Coast Guard, is answers to the Central Military Commission now. And these are basically fishermen with guns and radios, and they can do actual confrontation, and they can also do surveillance and communications about locations of foreign ships. So it kind of ties into your talk that way. And I wonder, are the maritime militia ships, are they licensed to do fishing? They are fishermen. How are they licensed, and how do they interact with the groups that you study?
Yeah, two really great questions, observations. You're totally right on the first point about the South China Sea. If China's considering that to be internal waters, they're not going to consider it distant water fishing, and that is the case. They consider all those fishing vessels to be part of the domestic fleet. There's been some discussion. I mean, there's always around the edges some, they do need to have 2 separate sets of licenses. There's some vessels that, will break the law and not abide by that. But for the most part, they seem to abide by that. And so I think the case is true with the South China Sea. Sometimes what you see, there's been some discussion of China using the Spratlys as jumping points for what would be distant water fishing further down into Southeast Asia. But interestingly, I think Indonesia is a really good example to kind of test this. So if you look at the Natuna Islands, China, the fleet that China sends down to do a lot of trawling activity they do off the Natunas, that's considered part of the domestic fleet. But then China also has a bilateral fisheries access agreement with Indonesia to fish in waters that are not kind of overlapping with China's 9-line claim. So yeah, anything kind of beyond the South China Sea and Southeast Asia is considered distant water fishing. So yeah, so that's a really good point. Where it doesn't, where that's not really the case is up in like the Yellow Sea and to a certain extent the East China Sea, where there's kind of a different set of, China has bilateral fisheries agreements with South Korea and Japan because they haven't delimited their maritime boundary. So they have like a kind of shared fishing zone there. And there are some vessels that fish illegally in the EEZs of South Korea and Japan. But at least in the case of South Korea, there's some that do fish legally in South Korea that China counts as its own domestic fleet, even though it recognizes those particular waters as being part of Korea's EEZ. So hopefully that makes sense. There's like parts where it's shared, and then parts where it's not.
It does.
Yeah.
How about the militia? Like, where do they fit in? Maritime militia?
So the maritime militia, so that is all domestic fishing fleets, fishing vessels. They are all licensed to fish domestically. And then this is also stuff that comes from the China Maritime Studies Institute, Naval War College, but I think it was Connor Kennedy. I think it was somewhere I heard that they, and actually I'm doing a little bit of research on this, particularly on the financing because of the subsidies issue. But it looks like 20%, I think there's kind of an understanding that about 20% is like the, more professional maritime militia that, is kind of trained and, like kind of placed under the command chain from, the Central Military Commission. And then you've also got, about 80% that are fishing vessels, in real terms, like they actually do engage in fishing vessels, unlike the, like the professional maritime militia that doesn't really, they're really just for, the militia purposes. But you've also got this recruitment of like regular fishermen who can participate in kind of this informal maritime militia. And so they, maybe sometimes engage in actual fishing operations. And so they're licensed for that. But then they're also, paid to provide other services, moonlighting on the side. So, and you see it too, like if you look at some of the maritime intelligence platforms, the China doesn't require IMO, International Maritime Organization, numbers for its domestic fleet. They do have their own domestic numbering kind of scheme, but that's not reported to, the IMO. And so a lot of those vessels, pretty much, I think most of them don't, the domestic ones in the maritime militia don't have IMO numbers, but a lot of the distant water fishing fleet does, because if they're fishing in areas that are governed by RFMOs, Regional Fisheries Management Organizations, they're required to have IMO numbers for their vessels. So it's
well, thanks. I know we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. You want to field those, Daniel?
Sure, absolutely. Actually, the first one we have is from Chengxi Quick, who said, to what extent and in what way will China's new Coast Guard law raise the risk of escalation with claimant countries in the South China Sea and East China Sea? What is the likely response from the Biden administration on this?
That's a good question. I feel like Ching Chui would probably be able to answer more of that than I would. I think there are, honestly, I'll be completely honest, I have not really looked so much at the Coast Guard law yet and how it pertains with the South China Sea. But I know based on some of the previous reforms that China has carried out with its Coast Guard, in some ways it does make kind of communication with the Coast Guard easier. And even though it increases China's unilateral capability, it also makes it, to kind of exert its claims over, the South China Sea. It also makes it easier for the channels of communication to function. So if there is kind of an incident there. I wish I had a better answer. It'd be really interesting to
I'll
hear
say
what Chung
something
Tree
about
thinks
it,
about this.
Tabitha. I can say something about this, Tabitha. I think you're right. Chung Tree probably knows more than any of us on this type of issue,
Yeah.
but he's kind enough to ask a question about it, so I'll give him a partial answer. And that is that, my take on the China's new Coast Guard law is largely that what China is doing is for the first time publicly stating what its Coast Guard always could do, which was to confront foreign ships in what they consider to be China's waters. It is I do think it's a bit of a deterrent warning or a coercive warning to China's neighbors that, remember, we have this big Coast Guard and it can do those things. But I don't know of a Coast Guard around the world that is not capable of firing on foreign ships or boarding foreign ships if they're considered inside the waters of that country. The problem with China goes back to my first question, is that it's not really clear what they're claiming as their waters. So it's a big potential source of misunderstandings and accidents involving other countries. And so if I were a neighbor, I'd be worried about it. But I don't think from an international legal perspective, China's new Coast Guard law is fundamentally different from what governs the U.S. Coast Guard activity in U.S. waters. All right, that's how we might take. But go ahead, back to the question.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that.
We'll certainly see. Next question comes from one of this year's fellows, Austin Strange. Can you provide any more detail about the emergence of overseas Chinese fisheries subsidies, offices, or access ports in developing countries? How large are these typically in terms of personnel and facilities? Do they involve any local employment? How permanent are they, et cetera?
Yeah, so I mean, this is something I would love to get to as a research project at some point, or, call on someone to do some more research on this, because I don't think there's a lot that's been, that is really known about these. And, there have been some that are a little more high profile in the media. So, there's one in Mauritania that's pretty well known. I'm forgetting now how many people they employ. I mean, they claim to employ a certain number of locals. I remember it not being, like a huge number, but they, that's part of kind of the spiel, for building some of these bases, that they get to, employ some of the locals and generate some local income. And they vary. So the one in Mauritania is really a pretty big facility, but they vary. There's also like a fish meal processing center in Gambia, and so they're different scales depending on the services that they provide. There's also the one that's there's a new one also in Daru in Papua New Guinea, which a lot of people are kind of curious about, because it's it's just kind of far from where a lot of the fishing centers are, and so people kind of are maybe a little suspicious about that. But yeah, so some of them provide pretty extensive fish processing capabilities, and some of them are just kind of like small offices to provide bunkering services for the vessels that are out at sea. So I think we do see some variation, and it also depends on which company is behind this. There's a pretty big range of distant water fishing companies now, and some there's some that are still large and state owned, and there's some private owned ones that are larger, some are smaller, and so we see some variation there. But I think a lot of the research has just been kind of mentions in the media. So I think, looking at this in a more concerted way, I think would really fill in a gap in our understanding about this. So, and they do get, he had asked about the funding. I mean, there's, understanding those flows would be really great too. There's some data from a while ago, but updates on that would be useful.
For sure. Next question is from Stephanie Char, who is a PhD candidate here at Columbia University. What has been the range of reactions by other states, especially Africa and Latin America, to China's DFW activities and policies? In particular, whether governments are tackling the issues bilaterally or multilaterally with China, and whether there are significant differences between the responses of local actors directly involved in fishing and central governments.
Yeah, so it's a really great question. All these questions are really great. And so I think there has been a realization for a lot of host countries that overall it tends to be the case, and this is not just China, this is also, there have been distant water fishing nations, the other really well-known ones, well, there's USSR, I mentioned that earlier, but Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Spain, they've been operating since the 1950s and 60s. And so by now there's enough evidence, that the fisheries experts can say that usually if you've got foreign fleets in your waters, it's generally not good for outcomes overall. And it's because, there's less of an incentive for a foreign fleet to manage the fish sustainably because they're not really directly feeling the impact. And in theory, it's the reasoning behind it is, you've got this developing country that has excess resources that doesn't have the technology or capability to harvest on its own. And so if you have foreign fleets come in, they can assist with that, and there can be some technology and skills transfer, but in practice that often doesn't happen. And you've got, a country coming in and, maybe setting up a joint venture, but in practice, it's actually all operated by the foreign country, and there's not that much control from the locality. And so but the problem comes in, so there is this recognition that there are these problems, but where the challenges are is that corruption is one of them. So, the local government or national government, the host government, can benefit by selling fisheries licenses. So there's been some kind of uncovering of these schemes where, like there's one case, I think it was Fiji, where the fisheries minister was selling, a bunch of licenses that, it was actually not even licenses. He was like handing out like letters that, said they could fish, which weren't really licenses. And so you'll see some of that going on. And then also, a lot of these countries, they just don't really have the capability to enforce, to carry out maritime enforcement over their own waters, because it's very costly, especially for Coast Guard vessels in terms of fuel. That's the kind of the number one cost. And so with the advent of new technologies like drones and things like that, I think that can really help with this. But you also need to have a certain level of training to use new technology like that, or maritime intelligence software. And you sometimes have to change like the local laws in order to prosecute cases like that. But I think, there is some pushback. And there was something else I was going to say about that. There was another, part of the solution is if countries act in a regional way to respond to China's or another country's presence in their waters, that can also be helpful. And so, we see this, especially I think off the coast of West Africa, where China will sign bilateral fisheries access deals with those, individual countries, and it leads to a race to the bottom in terms of standards, where countries kind of compete with each other to kind of sell the most licenses. But if you have a regional approach where you're agreeing on like a floor for this, then that increases the leveraging kind of power in response to China. So. So I do think there's a role for, especially, developed countries to kind of, work with this and help provide some of the access that they have to some of the technologies that are out there.
Makes sense. Next question is from Sasha Chambra, who is a joint master's student here at Columbia in the London School of Economics. How do distinctions in fleet and waters apply in waters claimed by Taiwan? You kind of touched on this a little bit already. What sort of conflict is there? Thinking about both Taiwan itself as well as waters off of Pratas and Taiping Dao.
Mm-hmm. Wait, is it in the Q&A? Actually, I'm going to stop my share.
It is in the Q&A, yes.
So just, okay. So, Taiwan, I think Taiwan is really interesting vis-a-vis China, and in terms of their own distant water fishing operations. So Taiwan, and I think other people will probably have the same experience, but Taiwan officially has the same policy as mainland China on the South China Sea, right? The same kind of stance. But in practice, there's definitely some divergence. And I mean, I've seen this, I think both in kind of the literature that we can read and also just anecdotally in my own experience. And I think there's another interesting layer here too, because of the kind of cross-strait relationship between China and Taiwan. Often that kind of conflict doesn't hold when it comes to fisheries, and there's a lot of cooperation on fisheries between mainland China and Taiwan. So there's a lot there, but with regard to these kind of different positions, Taiwan is the one that has proposed some of the post-sovereignty, meta-sovereignty ideas for the South China Sea, which I think are really a great solution for handling this. So you're essentially moving beyond, like what belongs to whom, and so the whole proposal of setting up a peace park in the Spratly Islands, I think is great, and I would love to see people push that more. And there was some discussion of maybe turning like something like that, the Scarborough Shoal into something like that, and I don't think that really went anywhere. But so Taiwan, it seems, has been a little bit more open to negotiating some of these aspects of the South China Sea than mainland China. And I've certainly seen it, like I said, just anecdotally in, maritime dialogues with mainland China. Often, there's really not that much traction in the conversation, not a lot of give and take. You can't, if you bring up a point with mainland China, like, oh, well, like international law says this, it's just kind of an iron curtain, brick wall. There's not a lot of back and forth. But with Taiwan, they'll oftentimes, I've found that, the experts over there will, maybe kind of adhere to their point about, the kind of the official stance on the South China Sea, but they'll acknowledge that they can see it from a different perspective, which I think is really helpful, because then you can kind of bring the conversation somewhere, even if you don't ultimately come to some kind of outcome or resolution to it. And we also see that with Taiwan and its willingness to sign a fisheries agreement with Japan, which China has condemned, and there was also some talk of doing something similar with the Philippines to manage that. And so I don't know. I think when we think of Taiwan, those are kind of the interesting nuances that I think of when it comes to managing the fisheries issue.
Yeah, I was going to say something about that, Tabitha, that your topic ties into security, IP, and environment, all three that I mentioned before. And Ma Ying-jeou's government in Taiwan was the one who signed the fishery agreement with Japan. And Ma Ying-jeou, in his thesis at Harvard, wrote about how the Senkaku Islands, or the Diaoyu Islands, were actually Chinese forever. So he had a kind of stake in the sovereignty, but he still was willing to cut a fisheries deal with Japan in that area. And there was talk in Taiwan at the time among his supporters that maybe he would get the Nobel Peace Prize for that gesture. It didn't work out that way. I think we have one more question. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, so the last question is from Wei Liang, who I believe is the professor at Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, who asks, how has China's negotiation position changed or evolved in the past 20 years of the WTO's fisheries subsidies negotiations? Are parties really going to conclude this negotiation anytime soon?
Yeah, it's a great question. The new head of the WTO has recently, when she took her position, she actually brought up fisheries as something that she wants to make progress on, in addition to COVID. But that was pretty encouraging for people who have been watching those negotiations. And so it's, there's a lot to work out still. And in some ways, I think it's not the end of the world that it was pushed back to this year, because there's a lot of rush to kind of get an agreement by the end of the year. But there's so much there, and it's really technical. And so I think the ways that China has changed is, and actually one of China's first kind of notifications to the WTO was about fisheries. So this has been an issue for them for a while. I think they have become a little more savvy in terms of the technical aspects of the negotiations, and in proposing certain ways to cap the subsidies. So some of their proposals are, like I said, they're very technical, but like how do you calculate the amount of subsidy that should be given, like depending on like the number of fishermen and like all these other aspects. And I don't see China necessarily having done that at the start of the negotiations, but and they're also a little bit, I think, in a diplomatic sense, a little in some ways behind the scenes. I mean, I haven't been sitting in on the negotiations, most people aren't allowed to, but just kind of what I've heard secondhand is, from people who have been in the negotiating room, China is not, for example, forcefully pushing to be considered a developing country, but what it'll often do is, so it gets special and differentiated treatment, will, kind of work with the countries that it sees as partners at the WTO, and kind of push for their support for China's position. So it kind of takes China out of the limelight a little bit. But then aside from that, China. So there's this kind of strange decrease in transparency in what China's reporting and how they're reporting it, and so like how many, like what kinds of answers we can get from what they're reporting. But they have reported in 2018 or 2019, actually 2019, they issued notifications about their subsidies program for the first time in a while. But when it came to like what amount is provided to the fuel subsidies, they wrote something like it varies depending on the province. So there was not actually an answer to the question about what the amount was. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
Okay, I think we've addressed all the questions, and the only thing left to do is to thank you, Tabitha. It's great to see you again, even though it's virtual. And thank you for your excellent talk. I learned a ton today. I think the other participants also learned a ton. And please come back and speak to us again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for all the great questions. And yeah, hope to see people soon in person.
Really fantastic. Thank you all. We have another event on Wednesday and another one on Friday. So feel free to go to our website and find out more details. And we'll see you then. Thank you again, Tabitha.
Thanks. Bye.